Enthusiastic consent. It's the buzzword of modern sex education, the gold standard, the rally cry. And don't get me wrong, I love it. Clear, joyful yeses are sexy as hell. But here's the problem. Not everyone's body or brain is wired to say yes in big, verbal, performative ways. If you're neurodivergent, if you're trauma impacted, if you've been socialized into silence or people-pleasing, enthusiasm might look more like quiet presence than cheerleader energy. Hi there, I'm Dr. Misty with Untamed Ember, and today we're digging into what enthusiastic consent really means and how to honor it even when words are hard. Here's the uncomfortable truth that mainstream consent education keeps glossing over. The way we've been taught to recognize enthusiastic consent is ableist as fuck. It assumes everyone's brain works the same way, everyone's trauma presents the same way, and everyone has equal access to verbal expression in intimate moments. And that's not just inaccurate, it's actively harmful. Because it tells people whose consent looks different that their yeses aren't valid, that their communication style is somehow less legitimate, that they need to perform a specific type of enthusiasm to have their boundaries respected. So today, we're burning that bullshit down. We're diving deep into what enthusiastic consent actually means when we strip away the ableist assumptions. We're exploring why words can be hard, not because you're broken, but because you're human, with a nervous system that has its own language. And we're talking about how to practice consent that honors everybody's way of saying yes. Because here's what I know after years of working with neurodivergent folks, trauma survivors, and people navigating intimacy. Your yes is valid even when it's whispered. Your boundaries matter even when they're communicated through body language instead of words. And your right to pleasure doesn't depend on your ability to perform enthusiasm the way someone else expects. If you've ever felt pressure to be more verbal during sex than feels natural, if you've ever struggled to find words when your body knew exactly what it wanted, if you've ever wondered whether your way of expressing desire counts as enthusiastic enough, this episode is your permission slip to stop performing and start being present. Let's get into it. So let's start by talking about what most people picture when they hear enthusiastic consent. Close your eyes for a second and imagine the stereotypical version. You're probably seeing someone who's super vocal, right? Saying things like, "Yes, I want this, more," with crystal clear articulation and zero hesitation. Maybe there's dirty talk involved. Definitely, there's that Hollywood-style passionate energy where everyone knows exactly what they want and can express it in complete sentences while simultaneously being turned on. It's basically the sexual equivalent of an infomercial. Overly enthusiastic, performed for an audience, and completely divorced from how most real human bodies actually work. And here's the thing. For some people, that version of enthusiasm is totally authentic. If you're someone whose natural communication style is verbal, expressive, and immediate, fucking amazing. I'm genuinely happy for you. But that's not everyone's neurology, and it sure as hell is not everyone's trauma response or experience. The cultural script around enthusiastic consent has created this incredibly narrow definition of what a proper yes looks like. And that narrow definition doesn't account for the massive diversity in how human beings communicate, process, and express desire. Let me break down what this script assumes. First, it assumes verbal expression is accessible to everyone in moments of vulnerability and arousal. Spoiler alert, it's not. For many neurodivergent folks, verbal processing goes offline precisely when they're emotionally activated. For trauma survivors, speaking during intimate moments can trigger shutdown or dissociation. For some disabled folks, verbal communication might require significant effort or might not be their primary language at all. Second, it assumes that enthusiasm presents as extroverted energy, loud, outward, and performative. But what about people whose authentic enthusiasm is quiet, introverted, deeply present, but not performatively expressive? Third, it assumes immediate response, that you can hear a question about consent and instantly know your answer and articulate it clearly. But what about folks who need processing time? What about people whose brains work more slowly, more carefully, more deliberately? And fourth, this is the one that really pisses me off. It assumes that if you're not performing this specific flavor of enthusiasm, you must not really be into it. That quiet consent is somehow suspicious. That a gentle nod or a soft isn't as valid as a shouted yes. This is ableism dressed up as sexual liberation, y'all. And it's everywhere. I see it in sex education curricula that teach enthusiastic consent without ever mentioning neurodivergence, disability, or trauma. I see it in social media posts that make it sound like if you're not verbally enthusiastic, you're doing consent wrong. I see it in relationship advice that treats silence as automatically problematic rather than potentially meaningful. And the cruel irony, this rigid definition of enthusiastic consent was supposed to protect people. It was supposed to make intimacy clearer, safer, more aligned. But instead, it's created a new kind of pressure. The pressure to perform your consent in a specific way or risk having it dismissed as not enthusiastic enough. Let me give you an example of how this plays out. I worked with a client, let's call them Reese, who is autistic and has significant processing delays around language during emotionally charged moments. Reese's partner had read all the consent literature and was genuinely trying to do right by them. So during intimate moments, the partner would ask, "Do you want this? Are you into this?" And Reese would freeze, not because they didn't want what was happening, but because being asked to verbally process and respond in real time was cognitively overwhelming. The partner interpreted the pause as hesitation and would stop everything, which made Reese feel broken and frustrated. They absolutely wanted the intimacy, but they couldn't produce the verbal enthusiasm their partner had been taught to look for. The relationship ended up in this painful loop where Reese felt pressured to perform a neurotype they don't have, and the partner felt confused about how to practice consent with someone whose communication style didn't match the script that they learned. Here's what nobody told them. Reese's consent was enthusiastic. It just didn't sound like cheerleader energy. Reese's yes showed up in their body, in the way they moved toward touch, in their deepening breath, in their intentional physical reciprocation. But because those signals didn't match the cultural image of enthusiastic consent, both people ended up feeling like they were failing. Not everyone is going to sound like they're auditioning for a Broadway musical when they're turned on. And that doesn't mean that they're not into it. It means that their enthusiasm speaks a different language. So before we can talk about what enthusiastic consent actually is, we need to collectively unlearn this myth that there's only one valid way to express it. We need to expand our definitions to include the full range of human neurology, trauma history, and disability experience. Because consent education that only works for neurotypical, non-traumatized, verbally fluent people isn't consent education, it's gatekeeping. Now that we've established that the cultural script around enthusiastic consent is limited as hell, let's dig into why words specifically can be so challenging during intimate moments. Because understanding the why is crucial to building consent practices that actually work for everyone. Let's start with the trauma lens, because this is where a lot of folks get stuck. When your nervous system perceives threat, and yes, vulnerability during intimacy can register as threat even when you consciously want what's happening. Your body has a few options. We've talked about these before if you've listened to previous episodes: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Here's what happens to language during these states. In sympathetic activation, that fight or flight mode, your prefrontal cortex goes partially offline. That's the part of your brain responsible for complex language processing and verbal expression. Your body is prioritizing survival functions over articulation. So you might know what you want, but getting words out feels effortful and impossible. In dorsal vagal shutdown, that freeze or collapse state, language often disappears entirely. Your system has decided the best strategy is to go numb, to disappear, or to minimize. Words require presence, and freeze is the ultimate absence. This is why trauma survivors sometimes describe feeling mute during overwhelming experiences, even when they desperately want to speak. And in fawn, that people-pleasing, appeasing response, words might come easily, but they're not necessarily honest. Your mouth says what it thinks will keep the peace, keep you safe, prevent abandonment or anger. This is the most dangerous state for consent because someone might be verbally saying yes while their body is screaming no. For trauma survivors, especially those with histories of sexual violation or coercion, the stakes around verbal expression during intimacy are incredibly high. Your nervous system learned that speaking up leads to harm, that saying no gets overridden, that your words don't matter anyway, so why bother forming them? And here's the truly fucked up part. Purity culture and religious sexual shame often specifically target verbal expression around desire. You were taught that even naming what you want is sinful, that good people don't talk about sex, that your desires are too shameful to speak aloud. So for folks with religious trauma, verbal expression during intimacy isn't just hard, it's laden with decades of conditioning that says your voice around sexuality is fundamentally wrong. Now, let's layer in the neurodivergent experience because this is where things get even more complex. For autistic folks, verbal processing during emotionally charged moments can be genuinely inaccessible. Many autistic people experience situational mutism or significant speech delays when they're overwhelmed, overstimulated, or emotionally activated. Intimacy hits all three of those triggers simultaneously. Add in sensory processing differences, the feeling of another person's body, the sounds, the textures, the temperature changes, and you've got a situation where your brain is already working overtime to process sensory input. Asking it to also generate verbal language is like asking someone to do calculus while running a marathon. And then there's alexithymia, difficulty identifying and naming emotions, which is common in autistic folks and trauma survivors. If you can't quickly identify what you're feeling, how the hell are you supposed to verbally communicate whether you want something to continue? For folks with ADHD, there's a different but equally real challenge. Your processing might be fast, but it's nonlinear. You might know you want something, but translating that embodied knowing into coherent verbal expression requires a type of executive function that intimacy absolutely disrupts. Your brain is 3 steps ahead or still processing something from 5 minutes ago, and trying to land in the present moment long enough to form words feels impossible. And we haven't even talked about disability yet. For people with speech disabilities, verbal apraxia, or conditions that affect language production, the assumption that consent must be verbal is literally exclusionary. It suggests that your capacity for intimacy is somehow less valid because your primary mode of communication isn't spoken language. For people who use AAC devices or sign language, the expectation of immediate verbal response during intimate moments is completely impractical. Are you supposed to stop everything, reach for your device, and type out, "Yes, I consent to this specific touch"? That's not creating safety. That's creating barriers. The bottom line is this. Words are great when they're accessible, but they're not the only language of consent, and treating them as such excludes a massive portion of the population from conversations about healthy intimacy. Your brain and body have their own languages, and those languages are just as valid, just as meaningful, and just as worthy of respect as verbal expression. So the question isn't how do we make everyone verbal during sex? The question is, how do we expand our understanding of consent to include all the ways humans communicate desire and boundaries? And that's exactly what we're diving into next. All right, so if the cultural script around enthusiastic consent is too narrow and words aren't always accessible, what the hell does enthusiastic consent actually mean? Here's my reframe. Enthusiasm isn't about volume. It's not about performance. It's not even necessarily about words. Enthusiastic consent is about 3 things: clarity, presence, and genuine alignment. Let me break that down. Clarity means that your yes or no is communicated in a way that's legible, not necessarily verbal, but understandable. It means there's no ambiguity about whether you want what's happening. Your communication, whatever form it takes, leaves no room for misinterpretation. Presence means you're actually in your body, not dissociated or performing. You're connected to your sensations, aware of your desires, and engaged in what's happening. Genuine alignment means your yes comes from authentic desire, not coercion, pressure, or obligation. There's congruence between what you're communicating and what you actually want. Your body and your expression are in agreement. When you have clarity, presence, and genuine alignment, that's enthusiastic consent. Even if it's quiet, even if it's nonverbal, even if it doesn't look like a Hollywood sex scene. So, what does enthusiastic consent actually look like when we expand our definition beyond the cultural script? It looks like a body that's leaning in rather than pulling away. It's the difference between someone who initiates touch, reciprocates, moves towards more contact versus someone who's still, passive, or subtly creating distance. It's breath that deepens and softens rather than breath that gets shallow, held, or irregular. Your breathing patterns tell an incredibly honest story about your nervous system state. It's muscle tone that's responsive and engaged rather than rigid with tension or limp with shutdown. Think about the difference between a hug where someone's body molds to yours versus a hug where they're stiff as a board. That's the difference we're looking for. It might be eye contact when that's comfortable and accessible for someone. For many people, sustained eye contact during intimacy signals safety and connection, but let me be crystal clear. For many autistic folks and trauma survivors, forced eye contact is uncomfortable and triggering. So this is about noticing patterns in the individual, not imposing neurotypical expectations. It's sounds, not necessarily words, but embodied sounds. Sighs of contentment, little noises, sharp intakes of breath that signal pleasure rather than panic. The sound of someone savoring an experience versus tolerating it. It's the way someone pauses, not to brace or dissociate, but to fully feel what's happening. That moment where someone closes their eyes not to escape, but to sink deeper into sensation. That's enthusiasm. That's a body saying, yes, this, more of this. Here are some concrete examples of what nonverbal enthusiastic consent can look like. A nod that's deliberate and present, not a mechanical, people-pleasing gesture. There's a quality difference there. One comes from the body, and the other comes from conditioning. A squeeze of the hand, especially when you've established that as your agreed-upon signal for yes, keep going. Moving toward touch rather than freezing in place. If you reach for someone and they move closer, lean into your hand, guide you to where they want to be touched, that's clarity right there. Reciprocal touch. If you're touching someone and they start touching you back in ways that feel intentional and exploratory, that's presence and engagement. That specific quality of stillness that's about savoring, not shutdown. You can feel the difference between someone who's gone limp because they're dissociating versus someone who's gone still because they're fully present with sensation and don't want to miss a second of it. Vocalizations that aren't words but clearly communicate pleasure. Those involuntary sounds that escape when something feels good and you're present enough to let your body respond naturally. Here's a metaphor that might help. Think about the difference between someone eating food because they're hungry versus someone eating food because they're genuinely enjoying it. The second person might close their eyes to focus on the flavor. They might pause between bites to savor. They might even say nothing at all, but you can tell by their body language, their attention, their engagement, that they're genuinely experiencing pleasure. That's what enthusiastic consent can look like. It doesn't have to be a performance. It just has to be real. And here's the crucial part. Enthusiastic consent means uncoerced and aligned. It's a yes that comes from desire, not duty. From wanting, not people-pleasing. From genuine interest, not fear of disappointing someone. This is why checking for the absence of a no isn't enough. Consent isn't just the lack of resistance. It's the presence of desire. It's the difference between someone who's passively allowing something to happen versus someone who's actively choosing it. Enthusiasm doesn't have to be fireworks. Sometimes it's a steady flame, quiet, sustained, deeply warm, and that flame is just as valid, just as precious as any loud celebration. The question we should be asking isn't, did they say yes enthusiastically enough? The question should be, are they present, clear, and genuinely aligned with what's happening? And the answer to that question shows up in bodies, not just words. So now that we've redefined what enthusiastic consent actually means, let's get practical. How do you honor consent, both giving and receiving it, when verbal communication isn't leading the way? This is where we build consent practices that work for neurodivergent bodies, trauma survivors, disabled folks, and anyone else whose communication style doesn't fit the mainstream script. First, agreed upon signals. This is consent practice 101 when you're working with nonverbal or limited verbal communication. Before you're in an intimate moment, when everyone's prefrontal cortex is online and language is accessible, you establish your signals. This might look like, if I squeeze your hand once, that means I'm good. If I squeeze twice quickly, that means pause. If I squeeze 3 times, that means stop. Or a thumbs up means yes. A flat hand means pause. A thumbs down means no. Or for folks who use sign language or have a few ASL signs they know, establishing specific signs for yes, no, more, pause, stop. The key here is that these signals need to be physically easy to do, even when you're in a vulnerable position or your hands are occupied, clear and distinct from each other so there's no ambiguity, practiced ahead of time so they become automatic. And here's what's crucial. These signals work both ways. If you've established that a hand squeeze means yes, then not squeezing is meaningful information. The absence of the yes signal is itself communication. Second, time to process. This is huge for neurodivergent folks, trauma survivors, and anyone whose processing speed doesn't match the cultural expectation of immediate response. Here's what this looks like in practice. You ask a question. Do you want to keep going? Can I touch you here? Does this feel good? And then you shut up and wait. Not for a second, not while you're mentally counting. You actually wait with spaciousness and patience for as long as it takes for the other person to check in with their body and form a response. This might take 10 seconds. It might take 30. For some folks, it might take a full minute or more. And that's not hesitation. They're checking in with themselves to give you an accurate answer. The person asking the question needs to hold the space without pressure, without rushing, without interpreting the pause as rejection or uncertainty. Just ask, breathe, wait. And for the person being asked, you get to take the time you need. And you don't owe anyone an immediate answer. Your processing time is valid and important. Third, layered check-ins. Consent isn't a one-time question at the beginning of an encounter. It's an ongoing conversation that happens throughout. So instead of asking once, do you want to have sex? And then assuming everything that follows is covered by that yes, you check in at transition points. Do you want this? When you're first initiating contact, does this still feel good as you're continuing? Do you want more before escalating intensity or moving to a new type of touch? Are you still with me if you notice any shift in the other person's energy or presence? And these check-ins don't have to be verbal questions every time. Once you've established your communication system, they can be a questioning look with a pause for a response, a hand hovering near but not yet touching, giving space for the other person to move toward or away, a whispered yeah with space for a head nod or a shake. The rhythm of check-ins should match the rhythm of the intimacy. More frequent when you're first learning each other's bodies, more subtle and intuitive once you've built a language together. Fourth, normalize no. This is critical. If you want someone to feel safe giving you a genuine yes, they need to trust that no is equally safe and respected. This means when someone says no or uses their no signal, you stop immediately, without pouting, without pressure, without negotiation. You respond with, "Thank you for telling me," or "I appreciate you being clear," or just a simple "okay" in genuine acceptance. You model that no doesn't mean rejection of you as a person. It just means no to that specific thing in that specific moment. You practice saying no yourself, even about small things, so your partner sees that boundaries are normal and expected, not threatening or punishing. You never, ever treat someone's no as a problem to solve or an obstacle to overcome. Because here is the thing. If someone has learned through experience that their no will be met with pressure, guilt, anger, or coercion, they stop saying no. They start saying yes to avoid conflict, even when their body is screaming no. And that's not consent, that's compliance born from fear. True enthusiastic consent requires the equal safety of yes and no. Fifth, co-regulation and nervous system tracking. This is the practice of paying attention not just to words or signals, but to the other person's nervous system state. You're watching for freeze responses like sudden stillness, blankness, eyes going unfocused. That's not presence, that's dissociation, and it means you need to pause and check in. Tension patterns, sudden rigidity in the jaw, shoulders, or pelvis, muscles that clench rather than soften. That's a body saying threat, and it deserves attention. Breathing changes. Breath that becomes shallow, irregular, or held. That's activation, and it might mean the window of tolerance is being exceeded. Sounds that shift from pleasure to distress. You learn the difference between a gasp of excitement and a gasp of panic, between a moan of arousal and a sound of pain or discomfort. If you notice any of these shifts, you pause. You don't wait for a verbal no. You treat the nervous system communication as the primary signal and check in immediately. This is consent as co-regulation. You're not just checking in with words, you're staying attuned to the other person's embodied experience and adjusting in real time. Finally, build your own dialect. Every relationship, every dynamic, every intimate connection can create its own consent language. There's no universal script that everyone has to follow. Maybe for you, silence is comfortable and safe, and you communicate through touch and breath and body language almost exclusively. Maybe you need frequent verbal check-ins because that's what helps you stay present. Maybe you have a few specific phrases or sounds that mean yes, and everything else is context dependent. Maybe you need to establish specific times to debrief after intimacy to talk about what worked and what didn't when you're no longer in a vulnerable state. The point is, consent is a language, and you get to be bilingual, multilingual, fluent in whatever forms of communication work for your unique nervous systems and histories. This isn't about following someone else's rules perfectly. It's about building a communication system that actually serves the people using it. And that system might be messy at first. You'll misread signals. You'll ask clarifying questions. You'll have to pause and talk things through. And that's not failure, that's the learning process that builds genuine intimacy and trust. Consent is a language, and every couple, every dynamic can build their own dialect. All right, I want you to pause with me for a moment, and if you're in a place where you can, take a breath and drop into your body. Think back to a moment, maybe recent, maybe years ago, where you wanted to say yes to something intimate, but words didn't come up. Maybe your throat closed up. Maybe your brain went blank. Maybe you just couldn't find language for what was happening in your body. What did your body do instead? Did you lean in towards the person or the touch? Did your breathing change? Maybe it deepened or quickened in a way that felt like excitement rather than panic. Did you make a sound, even just a small one, that came from genuine feeling? Did you reach out or press back or move in a way that communicated, yes, this? That was your yes. That was your body speaking its truth when your mouth couldn't find the words. And that yes was valid. It was real. It was enthusiastic in its own language. Now flip it. Think about a time when you felt pressured to say yes, or when you went along with something even though your body was saying no. What did that feel like differently? Maybe your body went still in a way that felt numb rather than present. Maybe your breath got shallow or held. Maybe you felt yourself leaving, not just physically, but mentally floating away from what was happening. Maybe there was tension in your jaw or your shoulders or your pelvis that wasn't pleasure or excitement, it was bracing. That was your no. And even if your mouth said yes or said nothing at all, your body was speaking clearly. So here's what I want you to consider this week. What signals mean yes for you? What does your body do when it's genuinely into something and when it wants more, when it feels safe and engaged? And what signals mean no for you? What does your body do when it's shutting down or checking out or tolerating something that it doesn't actually want? Notice these patterns, map them, write them down if it's helpful. Because the more you understand your own body's language, the more clearly you can communicate consent to yourself and to others in ways that actually work for your nervous system. Your body is always communicating, and the question is, are you listening? As we close today's episode, I want to leave you with this. Enthusiastic consent doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be performative. It doesn't have to sound like anything the sex ed pamphlets told you it should. It has to be real. Whether your yes comes out as a shout, a whisper, a nod, a squeeze, a sigh, or the quiet act of staying deeply present in your body, it's valid, it's powerful, and it's yours. The revolution in consent culture isn't about getting everyone to perform enthusiasm in the same way. It's about expanding our definitions wide enough to include every body, every brain, every communication style, every trauma history. It's about recognizing that clarity, presence, and genuine alignment can show up in 1,000 different forms, and all of them deserve respect. So if you're someone who's been made to feel like your consent doesn't count because you can't perform it the right way, I'm here to tell you that you've been lied to. Your way of communicating boundaries and desires is legitimate. Your body's language is valid, and anyone who wants to be intimate with you has a responsibility to learn how you communicate, not to demand that you communicate like someone you're not. And if you're someone who wants to practice consent better with partners whose communication styles are different from what you were taught, thank you. Thank you for being willing to expand beyond the script, to learn new languages, to prioritize genuine connection over performative checking of boxes. This work matters, because when we make consent accessible to everyone, not just to people whose brains and bodies happen to fit the cultural default, we create space for intimacy that's actually liberating. Your body deserves a yes that feels like freedom, no matter how it's expressed. If today's episode resonated with you, hit subscribe to Untamed Ember wherever you get your podcasts, because we're just getting started with these conversations. And join my newsletter at untamedember.kit.com for deep dives into shame smashing, body liberation, and the messy, beautiful work of reclaiming pleasure on your terms. Until next time, this is Dr. Misty with Untamed Ember, reminding you that your consent is valid, loud or quiet, verbal or embodied, perfectly articulated or messily felt. What matters is that it's genuinely yours. See you next episode.